November, 1884. The first hard snow had been falling on Halloran's Reach for 6 hours when Nora Vane set down her one carpetbag, opened the station's account books for the first time, and found, on the third page, the line that would eventually hang a man. She did not know it yet. She only knew the freight column did not add up, and that the number written there was a lie too neat to be an accident. She had come to the highest relay station on the Mosquito Pass Road to disappear. That was the whole of her plan. The name on the company letter in her bag was only half her own. Vane had been her mother's, before there was a husband, before there was a thing she would not speak of, and a bookkeeping post. This remote asked no questions a careful woman could not answer. The stagecoach that carried her up the last grade had groaned at every switchback, and when it stopped, the driver looked at her town coat and her ink-stained gloves and the soft leather ledger she held against her chest, and he did not bother to hide his opinion. "You'll be back down the mountain by the first real storm," he said. His name was Caleb Renner, and he drove relief for the line, the man they sent when a coach broke a wheel or a driver took fever, the man who knew every rut on that road in the dark. He was not unkind. He was certain, in the way of men who have buried their share of soft people the mountain swallowed. He carried her bag to the porch because his mother had raised him to, then stood back and let the station master look her over. The station master was Brock Halloran, and the station bore his family name. He was a heavy, weather-burned man of 50 with a gray-streaked mustache and a sheepskin coat gone shiny at the elbows, and he had run that relay since before the railroad surveyors first came sniffing at the pass. He read the company's letter twice and looked at her hands. "They sent me a clerk," he said to no one. "I asked for a man who could split wood, and they sent me a company girl with clean fingernails." The two words stuck. Company girl. By the second day, the hostler used them, and the cook used them, and the relief driver used them with a half-grin that was almost friendly, and not quite. Nora let it sit. A name you do not fight is a name that loosens its own grip. And besides, the work did not care what they called her. She lit the office lamp before dawn, and did not put it out until the figures behind her eyes blurred into the figures on the page. And somewhere in those first long nights, between the fare receipts and the hay invoices and the doctored freight charges, no one at Halloran's Reach could read well enough to question. She began to understand that the station was being murdered slowly, by arithmetic, and the men who lived in it could not see the knife. The man holding the knife was Thaddeus Crail. He owned the line, the coaches, the contracts, the right to carry the territory's mail over the divide. And twice a year he rode up in a black frock coat and a gray silk waistcoat with a gold watch chain across his belly, and he smiled at everyone, and he shook the station master's hand, and he went away having quietly bled a little more life out of the place. The freight charges on his waybills ran higher every season than the freight that had actually moved. The mountain stations were billed for repairs never made, for feed that never arrived, for tolls on a road the company itself owned. Each station, taken alone, looked merely unprofitable. That was the design. A station that loses money 3 years running can be declared worthless and shuttered, and the land beneath it, the water rights, the new railroad spur everyone whispered was coming, sold off cheap to the man who had arranged, on paper, for it to fail. Brock Halloran could not read a ledger. He could read weather and horses and men, and those had kept him alive 40 years on that pass. But the columns of figures were a foreign language, and when Crail's smiling agents told him the numbers were bad, he believed them. The way you believe a doctor speaking Latin over your own body. The relay was dying, and the man who loved it most could not say why. Nora could. She found it in the freight column on the third page. And then again and again, the same hand making the same too-clever lie across 3 years of books. She said nothing that first week. A woman who has spent her life being disbelieved learns to gather her proof before she opens her mouth. If you have ever watched someone good and quiet get written off in the first 30 seconds, dismissed for their soft hands, their clean coat, the wrong shape of their name, and felt that slow, private certainty that the room had it exactly backward, then you already belong here, and I'd be honored if you would subscribe and stay with me, because that is the only kind of story I tell on this channel. The overlooked one, proven right at last with the whole record set straight. Now let me tell you what the mountain did to Halloran's Reach that winter, and what one company girl with a colder head than any man on the pass did about it. It started, as the worst things do, as ordinary weather. The eastbound coach came up the grade on the morning of the 18th with 9 passengers and a mailbag, a hat brim of snow already on the driver's shoulders. Among the 9 was a young mother named Esther, traveling to a husband in Leadville she had not seen in a year, and her son Tobias, who was 5 and flushed with a low fever she kept telling herself was only the cold. There was a circuit preacher, a pair of mining engineers, and an old prospector who said little. They meant to change horses at the Reach and push on by noon. They would not leave for 4 days. By the time the fresh team was harnessed, the snow had thickened past anything Caleb Renner liked, and Brock Halloran walked out, squinted up at the pass, and made the only soft decision Nora ever saw him make. "Nobody goes over the top in that," he said. "Unhitch them. We wait it out." The passengers grumbled. The preacher spoke of an appointment. Halloran did not argue. He turned his back, which was its own kind of argument, and went to see about the coal. The storm came down off the divide that night like something with a grievance. Nora had seen prairie blizzards. This was a mountain one, the difference between a shout and a hand around the throat. The wind did not gust. It leaned, steady and enormous, hour after hour, until the office window bowed in its frame and a fine snow sifted through a crack she later stuffed with a torn waybill. By morning, the road had ceased to exist. The corral fence was a long, white spine. The freight shed was a smudge you could only find by knowing where it had been. For a day, they were merely snowbound, and snowbound was survivable. Halloran knew the drill. The horses were brought close and blanketed. The passengers were moved into the common room around the one good stove. There was salt pork and flour and dried apples, and there was coal, and the coal was the thing. Nora, who had spent a week learning exactly what the station owned, was the one who said the number out loud first. She had counted the coal against the invoices. The bins held 1/3 of what the company's book said had been delivered that autumn, another of Crail's phantom shipments, paid for, never sent. They had 3 days of fuel for a stove that 9 strangers and 2 exhausted men and 1 feverish child now depended on, in a storm with no sign of breaking. She told Halloran. He did not call her a company girl that night. He looked at the bins a long time, then at her, and something old and stubborn in him admitted without a word that the girl with the clean fingernails had counted right when no one else had thought to count at all. The second night was when Tobias worsened. His fever climbed, and Esther's calm cracked, and the cold crept in under every door no matter how they chinked it. The stove was eating there 3 days faster than the arithmetic had promised because a room full of frightened people opens the door, lets in the wind, feeds the fire too high. Nora rationed it. She wrote the ration in the margin of the ledger, so much coal at dawn, so much at dusk, the stove banked low between, because the ledger was the one place in her life where numbers had ever behaved, and putting the crisis into its columns was how she kept her own hands from shaking. Coal, hay, bread. Hours. She accounted for the storm the way she accounted for everything line by line, and the men watched, and slowly, without deciding to, began to do what she wrote down. On the 3rd day, Brock Halloran went out to the horses and did not come back. It was a thing that should not have killed him. He had crossed that yard 10,000 times. But the snow had buried the guide rope he himself had strung, and the whiteout that morning was total. A man could not see his own outstretched hand, and somewhere between the porch and the stable The oldest, surest man on the mountain lost the direction of his own front door. They found him at dusk when the wind dropped for one merciful hour, 20 feet off the rope line, sitting almost peacefully against the corral fence with the snow already smoothing him over. The lantern still gripped in a hand gone past cold. He had been trying to reach the horses. He had died doing the small daily work of keeping the station alive, and the station, which was his name and his whole life, did not pause for it. The storm closed back over the yard within the hour. That was the moment everything turned. Not the discovery in the ledger that came before and would matter later. This was the hinge, the one man with the rank to command Halloran's Reach, the one the passengers would have followed and the relief driver would have deferred to, was dead in the drifts, and the storm was not finished, and the coal was nearly gone. And in the common room, 9 frightened strangers and a sick child looked around for someone to tell them they were going to live. They looked, in the end, at the company girl. She did not give a speech. She had never in her life been able to give a speech. What she gave them was a list. She stood in the doorway, with snow still on her shoulders from helping carry Halloran in, took off her ink-stained gloves and put them back on again because her hands had to be doing something, and said the only things that were true. The coal will last 2 more days if we burn it the way I say, and not a lump more. The horses live if we do, a dead team in spring and the line shuts for certain. Nobody goes out that door alone. We tie off, 2 at a time, or we don't go. She looked at the preacher, who had opened his mouth. You can pray over the fire. It heats nothing. And then, to all of them, I keep the count. You keep to it. It should not have worked. A woman of 25 with no rank, no badge, no claim on the place but a clerk's wage. But she had kept the station's true accounts for a week while the men kept its comfortable lies. And some animal part of 9 cold strangers understood that the person who knows the numbers is the person who knows the danger. The preacher closed his mouth. The mining engineers went to bank the stove the way she said, and Caleb Renner, who had bet a coach driver she would be down the mountain by the first storm, looked at her across the dead station master between them and said, Quiet. Tell me what you need. What she needed was a man who could do the things her body could not. So that became the shape of it. She kept the count, and he kept the work. She rationed the coal to the lump, and he carried it. She measured the horse's hay by the armful, and he forked it. When Tobias's fever broke the cabin's nerve on the long 3rd night, it was Nora who knelt with Esther and a tin cup of melted snow and a cool cloth, and her own steady, low voice doing the arithmetic of a child's breathing. So many breaths, slowing good. And it was Caleb who fed the stove 1 extra careful lump on his own authority and dared her, with his eyes, to write it down as waste. She did not. She wrote, 1 lump, the boy. The ledger held that, too. They learned each other in those days the way you only can when the wider world has been erased and there is no one left to perform for. He learned that the company girl had hands that did not shake even when her voice did, that she kept a small gold locket at her throat she never opened and he never asked about. She learned that the man who had written her off carried half-frozen children inside his own coat without being asked, that he talked to the horses by name in a low river of nonsense that calmed them, that the certainty she had taken for contempt was mostly the armor of a man who had watched the mountain take too many people he could not save. Once, near the end, both of them too tired to be careful, he said, Halloran would have sat the strongbox on the porch and dared the storm to take it. You thought about the horses. It was not a compliment a man like Caleb Renner gave lightly, and she only nodded, because thanks would have been a performance, and they were past those now. The strongbox sat through all of it on the office table, and Nora kept its brass key on a ribbon at her wrist. It held the fare money, the mail receipts, the station's small cash, and the ledger, which by then she guarded more carefully than the coins. On the second day, a frightened mining engineer, reasoning that money belonged in the hands of the men, reached for the box. Caleb Renner, who a week before would not have crossed a room for the company girl, put one hand flat on the lid and said, "She holds the key. That's the end of it." The man stepped back. That was the moment Nora understood the mountain had quietly changed the order of who counted at Halloran's Reach. The ledger she had been mocked for carrying had become the one thing no one disputed she was meant to hold. On the fourth morning, the wind stopped. It stopped all at once, the way mountain storms do, and the silence after 3 days of that enormous leaning weight was so total it woke everyone at the same instant. The light through the frost was the thin gold of a sun that had forgotten it owned the place. Caleb Renner went out first, roped, with his lantern and shovel, and Nora heard him laugh once, sharp and disbelieving at the size of what they had survived. The drifts stood higher than the porch roof. The road was a memory, but the horses were alive, every one gaunt and steaming and alive, because a company girl had counted the hay against the days and not let a single soft heart overfeed them into starvation when the storm ran long. And 9 passengers were alive, and a 5-year-old boy named Tobias was awake and asking for breakfast, his fever broken in the night. It took Caleb 2 more days to dig the road open, out in the drifts from first light, freeing the pass and the corral gate and the horses. The lantern hung on a pole so the diggers below could find the line. Nora ran the station. She wrote the report of Halloran's death in a clean, steady hand, logged every soul saved and every lump of coal spent, and settled the stranded passengers' fares, charging no man for the 4 days the mountain had stolen. When the eastbound coach at last went down the grade with its 9 living passengers, Esther stopped at the office door with Tobias on her hip and said the thing people say, "I won't forget you." Nora, who had spent her whole life being forgotten on purpose, found she believed her. And then the snow began to melt, and the road came back, and word of what had happened at Halloran's Reach went down the mountain ahead of her, and so, eventually, did word back up it, that Mr. Thaddeus Crail was coming in the spring to inspect the station that had, by his own books, finally and at last failed. He did not come alone, and that was his first mistake. Crail brought a territorial auditor, a thin, sober-spectacled man named Aldous Finch the territory employed to certify the closure and the sale of the land, because the railroad spur was no longer a whisper, and the ground Halloran's Reach stood on had quietly become worth a great deal to a man who could buy it cheap. Crail meant the auditor to witness a foregone conclusion. He had run the same play at 4 stations down the line, and 4 times the books had said exactly what he wanted. He had simply never had a bookkeeper at one of those stations who could read. He rode up in the black frock coat and the gray silk waistcoat, the gold watch chain catching the spring sun. And he smiled at Nora Vane on the porch the way he smiled at everyone. And he asked, with great courtesy, to see the station's accounts. She had been waiting for that sentence for 5 months. She laid the worn brown ledger open on the office table, in the same window light that had once fallen on Brock Halloran's body, and she did not say very much because the truth, properly arranged, does not need a voice raised behind it. She turned to the freight column. She set Crail's own waybills, the originals, which a careless company had let a careful clerk keep beside the entries, and put one ink-stained finger on a single crooked line. "This shipment," she said to the auditor, not to Crail. 3 tons of feed, billed and paid in October. No coach logs it, no hostler signed for it. The horses ate the company's own hay all winter, which I also have, by the bale." She turned the page. "And this one, and this." 3 years of phantom freight, each a small, neat lie, and under each now an original waybill in Crail's own contracting hand that did not match. Aldous Finch was a dull man and a thorough one, which is the most dangerous thing an honest institution can send. He took the ledger to the window and read a long time. Crail's smile held for 10 minutes, then began, very slightly to set the way mortar sets. Still a smile, no longer alive. The auditor looked up at last and said the quietest possible sentence, the worst one Crail could have heard. "Mr. Crail, I'll need to take these books to Denver." That was all. There was no shouting. The cleanest reckonings are the ones where the guilty man simply runs out of room. Crail tried the only weapon he had left. He turned to the auditor and said, with a last cold civility, that the station's clerk was a woman of no standing under a name that wasn't wholly her own, and her books could hardly be trusted against a gentleman's. And Caleb Renner, who had come to stand in the doorway with his hat in his hand and a coil of rope still on his hip, said the truest thing in the room. She held this station through the worst storm in 40 years when better men than you ran for Cheyenne. I'd trust her count against the Bible. Nora did not look up from the ledger, but something in her chest, braced against the world since before there was a name she would not speak, eased by a single degree. Crail went down the mountain that afternoon with the auditor's seal on his books and the law moving slow and certain behind him. By summer, the inflated waybills had unwound 4 stations' worth of fraud. The territory voided his contracts, and Halloran's Reach was certified not as a failed station, but as a profitable one. A thief had been bleeding, saved, with the railroad spur that came the next year, for the families up and down the pass, whose whole livelihood was the road. He was not destroyed in front of anyone. He was simply displaced, the way such men are. A smaller man getting into a coach, going somewhere it would take longer to be believed. Nora Vane stayed. She had come to disappear, and instead she had been, for the first time in her life, completely seen. And it turned out that was the thing she had actually been running toward all along without knowing its name. She set the ledger on the office shelf where Brock Halloran's pipe still rested, because some accounts you keep open for the dead. She kept the strongbox key on the ribbon at her wrist, because the new station master, the company, sheepish now, had asked her to name him. Was a relief driver named Caleb Renner, who could split any wood on the mountain but could not read a freight column to save his life. And they both knew who would go on keeping the count. He asked her to stay on a gold evening in late May, on the porch, the pass below them green and dripping and the last snow gone from all but the high peaks. He turned his hat in his hands the way a man does when he has driven over rougher ground than any storm. He did not ask her to stay as a clerk. He asked her for every season after, and she, who had spent her life keeping careful track of what she owed and what she was owed, found there was nothing to weigh. She said yes the way she did most true things quietly only once, and meaning it to the last decimal. The locket at her throat she opened for him that night, and what was in it, and the name she had been running from, she told to exactly one person on this earth, and it stayed there, where it belonged, in the keeping of a man who had learned what her count was worth. If this story stayed with you, sit a moment with the quiet of it, the long patience it takes to be proven right by the very thing they mocked you for carrying. Let me ask you the question I think this story is really about. Have you ever been completely wrong about someone in the first minute, written them off for their soft hands or their quiet way, and lived long enough to learn how badly you'd misjudged? Or have you been the one written off, and waited for your winter to prove them wrong? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if you want another story about the people the record books overlooked, and the few who refused to let them stay forgotten, there's one waiting for you right here.